The ship hummed quietly as it drifted through the black sea of space. Inside, the air was thick with pride. The crew of the illustrious Beacon, an elite exploration vessel from a world that considered itself the height of civilization, moved with purpose. They had captured something special, something no one in the fleet had done before. The human sat in the center of the small containment room. His wrists were bound, and his sharp eyes darted around the gray metallic walls. He was dressed in plain, practical clothing, stained with dust and grime from his homeworld. To the aliens, he looked primitive and unimpressive. But that was the mistake all of them made. From the corner, a tall, pale-skinned officer stepped forward. His uniform was spotless, his posture perfect. His name was Captain Orcs, and he led the crew of the illustrious Beacon with absolute authority. He gazed down at the human with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. So, Orcs began, his voice calm and measured. "You are the infamous Deathworlder. The one they say can survive anything. Let me assure you, human, that while you may have endured the harshness of your primitive world, you will find no advantage here. I will break you. I will tame you. And you will serve me as a loyal, obedient pet." The human raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He knew better than to respond. Instead, he listened. He watched. Every word the captain spoke, every movement the crew made, he absorbed it all. Even their insults and mocking laughter were valuable. They thought he was simple, but their arrogance was a gift. They didn't see him as a threat. That was their first mistake. Orcs turned to one of his officers. "Prepare him for conditioning," he ordered. "Let's show our colleagues just how easily a Deathworlder can be trained." The officer saluted and moved to comply, but the human's mind was already racing. He studied the officer's grip on the control panel. He noted the way the door mechanism clicked twice before sliding open. These small details might mean nothing to the aliens, but to him, they were the keys to freedom. The room the human was brought to next was larger and filled with strange devices. Transparent screens displayed lines of text in an alien language, and sleek machines hummed softly against the walls. In the center stood a platform, clearly designed for holding a subject in place. "Strap him in," Orcs ordered. 2 guards approached the human, their movements confident. They grabbed his arms, pulling him toward the platform. The human didn't resist, not yet. Instead, he allowed them to secure him. He felt the metal clamps tighten around his wrists and ankles. It was uncomfortable, but he remained still, his expression blank. They expected resistance, but by offering none, he disrupted their expectations. It made them careless. Orcs stepped closer, studying the human's face. "You seem calm, Deathworlder," he said. "Perhaps you don't understand the position you're in. No matter. Soon enough, you'll learn your place." The human tilted his head slightly, as if to say, "Perhaps you'll learn yours." The captain didn't notice. He was too busy giving orders, instructing his officers on the procedure. The human stayed quiet, his eyes scanning the room. There were 7 officers in total, each one busy at a console or monitoring the equipment. The walls were smooth and featureless, except for a single vent near the ceiling. He noticed how one officer adjusted the temperature from their console. It didn't seem important now, but it could be later. A faint vibration ran through the platform as the machines powered up. The human felt the hum travel up his arms and legs, steady and strong. It wasn't painful, not yet, but it was designed to disorient him. He closed his eyes, pretending to be affected, while his ears picked up the faint clicking of a nearby panel. Someone was adjusting the output. The human filed that sound away, along with the sharp hiss of the air filter and the periodic beeping from the main console. Each sound was a clue. Orcs watched, waiting for a reaction. "You're not as impressive as the stories suggest," he muttered. Perhaps you're just another savage from a dying world. The human opened his eyes slowly and met Ornax's gaze. For the first time, he spoke, his voice low and steady. You talk too much. The room fell silent. The officers froze, unsure how to respond. Ornax's expression darkened, and he took a step closer. What did you say? The human didn't answer. He had already shifted his focus back to his surroundings. He could feel the slight give in the restraints around his wrists. They were sturdy but not unbreakable. The platform beneath him vibrated in a predictable pattern, and he noted the timing. Every 6 seconds, a slight pulse ran through it. It wasn't much, but it could be used. Ornax leaned in, his face only inches from the human's. I think you need to be reminded of your place, Deathworlder. The human smiled faintly, just enough to unnerve the captain. Ornax straightened, waving a hand. Increase the output, he ordered. The officer at the console hesitated. Sir, if we push it too far. Do as I say. Ornax snapped. The officer obeyed, adjusting the controls. The hum grew louder, and the platform's vibrations intensified. The human tensed, feeling the increased pressure against his body. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't unbearable. What mattered most was the pattern. He counted each pulse, memorizing the intervals. After a few moments, the platform's vibrations settled into a steady rhythm. The human closed his eyes again, feigning discomfort. He hunched his shoulders slightly, letting out a small, deliberate groan. The officers exchanged glances, thinking they'd won. Ornax smirked, convinced the human was finally showing weakness. See? Ornax said, addressing the room. This is what happens when you stand against superior beings. Even the toughest Deathworlder will break eventually. The human slumped forward, making it appear as though he was losing strength. Inside, his mind was sharp and focused. He had the timing down. Every 6 seconds, the platform pulsed, creating a slight shift in the restraints. It was subtle, but it was enough. He flexed his wrists carefully, testing the give. The metal pressed against his skin, but he felt it budge ever so slightly. Ornax turned his back, speaking to his officers. Once we've subdued him, we'll. The human moved. It was quick and precise. The platform pulsed, and in that instant, he pulled with all his strength. The restraint on his right wrist snapped free. Before the officers could react, he reached across, releasing his left hand. The platform pulsed again, and he swung his legs forward, breaking the ankle restraints. Stop him! Ornax shouted. But the human was already off the platform. He ducked as a guard lunged at him, using the alien's own momentum to slam them into a console. Sparks flew as the equipment shorted out. Another officer tried to grab him, but the human grabbed a loose cable and swung it hard, knocking the alien to the ground. The room erupted into chaos. Alarms blared as the human darted toward the door. An officer hit a control panel, trying to seal it, but the human was faster. He jammed his shoulder against the edge, forcing it open just enough to slip through. Ornax's voice echoed behind him, furious and panicked. Don't let him escape. The human ran down the corridor, his bare feet barely making a sound against the cold metal floor. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he didn't need to. He'd seen enough. He knew the ship's layout well enough to find a hiding spot, a place where he could regroup and plan his next move. He wasn't just running. He was observing, learning, and adapting. The ship's arrogant crew thought they could break him, but they didn't realize they were dealing with someone who thrived under pressure. Every step he took, every corner he turned, he was gathering information. He would find a way out. He would outsmart them. Because that's what Deathworlders did. They survived. They adapted. And they never gave up. The illustrious beacon sailed through the void, a glowing beacon of technology and arrogance. Its corridors were clean, its systems intricate, and its crew self-assured. It was a ship that prided itself on control over their environment, control over their technology, and, most recently, control over their human captive. They believed the latter was a foregone conclusion. The humans, after all, were a species from a so-called Deathworld, a savage, chaotic planet. It was laughable to think that one of these creatures, stripped of their primitive tools and harsh environment, could ever pose a serious threat. The human knew that's how they thought. That was their second mistake. After the dramatic escape attempt, the alien officers had quickly mobilized. Their prisoner had been recaptured within hours, pulled out of an access shaft where he'd wedged himself like a stubborn animal. This time, they reinforced his restraints, locking him into a small, featureless holding cell. Ornax himself ordered round-the-clock monitoring. "I want no more surprises," the captain barked. "Keep him contained and under constant watch." The human sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his gaze fixed on the room's only point of entry, a smooth, sealed hatch. He knew they were watching him. A small camera mounted in the corner tracked his every move. This cell wasn't like the last one. There were no obvious panels to tamper with, no vents within reach, and no loose equipment lying around. On the surface, it seemed escape-proof. But the human didn't need obvious tools. He had something far more valuable, their ignorance. For hours, he did nothing. He sat still, his breathing slow and steady. He knew the aliens expected him to lash out, to test the walls or claw at the seams of the door. But he gave them nothing. Instead, he listened. The hum of the ship's systems became a background melody, punctuated by the faint clink of footsteps as guards passed by. He couldn't see them, but he could hear them, left, pause. A 2-second gap, then right again. Patterns. He needed patterns. As he sat in silence, the crew grew restless. They whispered to each other in the corridors, wondering why the Deathworlder wasn't acting like the vicious animal they'd been warned about. Some began to think the captain had exaggerated the human's reputation. Others, more cautious, wondered if he was planning something. Ornax dismissed their concerns. "He's just a primitive," he said. "No doubt he's realized his place. He'll cooperate soon enough." But the human wasn't cooperating. He was observing. He noticed how the camera in the corner flickered every 40 seconds, a minor power fluctuation that might indicate a surge elsewhere in the ship. He noticed how the lights dimmed slightly when the engines changed output, suggesting that certain power relays were overloaded. Most importantly, he noticed that the guards' patterns shifted after meal breaks. One of them always lingered a second too long, likely checking their communicator before continuing the patrol. He began testing his chains, subtly. He didn't tug or yank. Instead, he twisted his wrist slightly, feeling for any give. The cuffs were solid, but the anchor points on the wall seemed less so. He moved slowly, never drawing attention to himself. Over hours, then days, he found a faint wiggle in one bolt. Not much, but enough to work with. Meanwhile, Ornax ordered the officers to begin the conditioning process. A sleek, silver device was brought into the cell, mounted near the ceiling. It emitted a low-frequency sound intended to disorient the human, making him more compliant. Ornax was confident that this would break the human's will. The first officer asked if they should sedate the prisoner, but Ornax waved the suggestion away. "No need," he said. "The sound will do the work." The human barely reacted to the hum. In truth, it was annoying, but no worse than the sounds of a windstorm back on Earth. He closed his eyes and focused, allowing the sound to fade into the background. The aliens were relying on their technology to wear him down, but all it did was reinforce his patience. It gave him time to think, time to plan. After several days, the crew began to notice something odd. minor system malfunctions started cropping up. A door in the engineering bay jammed for no apparent reason. A climate control panel on Deck 3 displayed an error message that couldn't be traced back to the mainframe. Most puzzling of all, the power draw in the prisoner's cell fluctuated slightly, even though he was under constant watch. Could he be doing something? One officer asked. Ornax scoffed. Impossible. He's locked in a bare room with no tools. It's just a coincidence. But the human knew it wasn't. He had figured out a way to subtly manipulate the magnetic anchors holding his restraints. The energy surges from the conditioning device created micropulses in the walls, which he used to gradually loosen the bolts. It was slow work, requiring precise timing. If he moved too quickly, the guards would notice. If he moved too slowly, he might lose the opportunity. It was a delicate balance, but one he was determined to master. By the end of the week, the human managed to free one wrist during a short blackout caused by a maintenance test. He quickly returned the restraint to its original position, leaving it loose enough to escape again if needed. The next day, he did the same with his other wrist. He was still chained to the wall, but he now had control over when and how he could free himself. Ornax remained confident, but the crew's morale started to waver. He's not what we expected, one officer muttered. He's too quiet. Too calm. Another officer agreed. I heard that Deathworlders can endure anything. What if the conditioning isn't working? Ornax dismissed their concerns. He's biding his time, waiting for us to show weakness. But he'll find none. We're the superior species. This primitive creature will serve us, just as all lower beings should. The human, listening through the walls, smiled faintly. He knew the captain's overconfidence was his greatest ally. While the crew argued and doubted, he worked. While Ornax slept soundly, believing his ship was secure, the human planned. Every small action he took was a step toward freedom. Every flickering light, every subtle power surge, every minor malfunction, they were the threads he was pulling, one by one. By the end of Part 2, the human still sat in his cell, his face calm and his posture relaxed. But inside, he was a storm of preparation and purpose. The chains around his wrists hung loose, though they appeared secure. The camera above him flickered once, then twice. The ship's systems hummed in their steady rhythm, masking the faint sound of a bolt falling to the floor. The human didn't move yet. He didn't need to. The time wasn't right. Not yet. The lights on the illustrious beacon flickered briefly, a harmless-seeming event that went unnoticed by most of the crew. For those in command, it was yet another minor glitch in a week full of them. Engineers grumbled about having to chase down power surges, while officers dismissed the disruptions as routine maintenance hiccups. But for the human in his cell, that flicker was confirmation, his groundwork was starting to pay off. He sat against the wall, his face expressionless, his breathing calm. Anyone watching the monitor would think he had finally resigned himself to captivity. They wouldn't see the small wire he had palmed or the tiny shard of metal he'd carefully extracted from a loosened bolt days before. These were the tools of someone who had studied every detail of his surroundings, patiently waiting for the right moment. In the command room, Captain Ornax stood tall, his pale skin reflecting the soft glow of the main console. He addressed his officers with his usual air of authority. The Deathworlder's conditioning is progressing as expected, he announced. It's only a matter of time before he's fully compliant. I want to remind everyone that this is not a moment for complacency. Keep the guard rotations tight. We'll soon demonstrate to the fleet how even the most unruly of species can be tamed. The officers nodded, though their expressions showed varying levels of confidence. Some still believed in Ornax's plan. Others were starting to have doubts. The human's uncanny ability to remain calm despite the conditioning sessions had begun to unnerve them. Yet no one dared voice their concerns to the captain. In the lower levels of the ship, the human's sabotage had caused a slight disruption in the ventilation system. Nothing drastic, just a minor increase in temperature that went unnoticed by the higher-ranked officers. The maintenance crew, however, was less forgiving. They cursed the outdated wiring and the constant need for recalibration. The human knew their frustration would distract them, making it easier to continue his subtle work. One of the guards assigned to watch the human entered the cell, carrying a standard meal tray. It was routine now: bring food, check the restraints, leave. The guards had grown complacent, assuming the human was no longer a threat. This guard, in particular, didn't even glance at the camera as he set the tray on the floor. "Eat," the guard grunted, his voice flat. The human looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the guard's. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silent, steady gaze was enough to make the guard shift uncomfortably. After a moment, the guard turned and left, muttering something about Deathworlder stairs. Once the door closed, the human picked up the tray. The food was the same bland, nutrient-packed paste they'd been giving him since his capture. He didn't mind. He wasn't eating for pleasure. He was eating to maintain strength. He knew he would need it soon. When the next power flicker came, the human acted quickly. Using the wire and metal shard, he finished unlocking the restraints that still bound his ankles. The clicks were faint, barely audible over the hum of the ship. He moved slowly, keeping his movements precise. His hands were free, his legs unshackled, but he remained seated. He knew better than to rush. Patience had gotten him this far. It would carry him through the next phase. The human's next target wasn't a physical lock or a piece of equipment. It was the crew itself. He had listened carefully during the few interactions he'd overheard. Some of the lower-ranked aliens muttered complaints about Orcs. They didn't like his arrogance or his insistence on turning the human into a pet. Others resented the extra work caused by the recent malfunctions. They weren't rebels by any means, but they were frustrated. And frustrated people were more likely to make mistakes. The human began leaving subtle signs, small things, like placing an empty food tray slightly out of place or loosening a panel just enough to cause a minor alarm. These acts were too insignificant to be seen as sabotage, but they added to the growing tension on the ship. The crew started to doubt their own competence. Orcs, ever confident, dismissed their concerns, which only deepened their frustration. One officer, a tall, lean alien with a quiet demeanor, began to wonder if the human was behind the disturbances. He mentioned it to a fellow officer, who laughed it off. "What could he possibly be doing?" the second officer said. "He's locked up. No tools. No access. You're imagining things." The human's patience was rewarded when, during a scheduled maintenance check, two junior engineers began arguing over who was responsible for the recent power surges. The argument escalated, and one of them stormed off. The human listened carefully, noting the direction the angry engineer took. The man's frustration might make him careless, leaving a panel open or a tool behind. Sure enough, the human heard the faint sound of a dropped spanner a few minutes later. He filed that away, knowing he might have another tool at his disposal soon. The next shift change brought an opportunity. The guard who brought the human's meals had grown increasingly sloppy. He left the door ajar for a fraction of a second longer than usual, allowing the human to glimpse a control panel on the wall. It wasn't a direct route to the ship's systems, but it confirmed something the human had suspected: the wiring in this section was old, prone to interference. A short here or a crossed connection there could create the sort of chaos he needed. Back in the command room, Orcs was giving another speech. He enjoyed hearing himself talk, relishing the sound of his own authority. "The Deathworlder is subdued," he declared. "Soon, we'll present him to the fleet as proof of our superior methods." An officer interrupted him, hesitantly. "Sir, we're still seeing those minor malfunctions." "Insignificant," Orcs snapped. Fix them. That's what you're here for. The officer fell silent, though his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. Ornax ignored him and continued his speech. His belief in his own infallibility blinded him to the growing cracks in his crew's morale. It also blinded him to the humans' next move. Late that night, when most of the crew were resting, the human took his first real step toward turning the tables. Using the small shard of metal, he triggered a subtle short in the cell's control panel. It didn't open the door, it wasn't meant to. Instead, it caused a power fluctuation that tripped a secondary alarm in a nearby corridor. 2 guards rushed to investigate, leaving their posts. The human remained still, his movements minimal. He needed to keep their focus elsewhere. The ship's intercom crackled as Ornax's voice boomed through the corridors. All personnel, maintain your positions. This is a minor systems test. The human smiled faintly. Ornax's confidence was unshakable, even in the face of mounting issues. It would make the final steps all the more satisfying. The human didn't just want to escape. He wanted the crew to question their captain, to see him as fallible. Once that happened, the human knew he could take control, not by brute force, but by turning the crew's own doubt against them. By the time the guards returned to the cell, the human was back in his restraints, the loose cuffs secured just enough to appear locked. The guards checked the panel, found no visible damage, and left, muttering about how they'd been called away for nothing. They didn't know the human had used that time to memorize the corridor layout outside his cell. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. The human sat back and closed his eyes. His plan was progressing. He'd tested the chains. He'd learned the patterns. Now he was ready to start exploiting them, one small act at a time. When the lights flickered again, the human didn't move. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what came next. The illustrious beacon was no longer the flawless bastion of control it once appeared to be. Small malfunctions in the ship's systems had become a steady drumbeat of frustration for the crew. Lights flickered more frequently. Doors opened and closed with irritating delays. Environmental controls shifted without warning, forcing maintenance crews to scramble to maintain comfortable conditions. Captain Ornax's patience, once unshakable, had begun to wear thin. He paced the bridge, his arms folded tightly behind his back, his pale skin seeming even paler under the harsh glow of the consoles. Around him, officers worked feverishly to isolate the cause of the disturbances, but their efforts bore little fruit. "Status report," Ornax demanded, his voice sharp. An engineering officer turned from his station. "We're still investigating, Captain. The power surges appear to be coming from multiple points in the ship. It's as though the systems are working against each other." Ornax scowled. "Impossible. This vessel is the pinnacle of our engineering. The only explanation is incompetence. If you can't resolve these issues, I'll find someone who can." The officer nodded stiffly and returned to his work. But the truth was that no one on the crew fully understood what was happening. And that uncertainty was beginning to gnaw at them. In his cell, the human could feel the shift in the crew's morale. He didn't need to see their faces or hear their words to know. The increased frequency of patrols, the hurried footsteps in the hallways, the way guards hesitated before entering his cell, these were all signs of growing unease. They still thought of him as a captive, but that illusion was starting to crumble. The human's small acts of sabotage continued. He loosened another bolt on the cell's access panel, causing a temporary short in the monitoring equipment. When the guards came to fix it, he sat perfectly still, his eyes half closed, giving them no reason to suspect him. They fixed the panel quickly and left, never realizing that he had memorized the emergency override code displayed on the console before they closed it. Meanwhile, he made a point to study the guards themselves. He noted the ones who seemed tired, the ones who seemed angry, and the ones who seemed unsure. Those who grumbled about the increased workload or muttered under their breath about Ornax's growing demands were of particular interest. The human had no intention of trying to convince the entire crew to turn on their captain. He didn't need all of them, just a few. The next opportunity came during a maintenance cycle. The engineers had scheduled a brief power down of certain systems to recalibrate the ship's mainframe. While the crew worked to ensure the transition went smoothly, the human made his move. Using the loose restraint around his wrist, he created a subtle feedback loop in the cell's control panel. When the systems came back online, the cell's locks appeared secure on the monitors, but in reality, they were no longer functioning. He waited. Patience had been his greatest weapon so far, and he saw no reason to abandon it now. Even though his restraints were effectively unlocked, he remained still, his breathing steady, his expression neutral. The longer he waited, the more the crew would believe their control over him was absolute. That belief was key to his plan. Ornax's frustration spilled over in a meeting with his senior officers. This ship has never experienced such persistent technical issues before, he snapped. What changed? What variable was introduced that could explain this chaos? One of the officers hesitated before speaking. The human, Captain. Ever since we brought him aboard. Are you suggesting, Ornax interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain, that a primitive creature from a death world could somehow outwit our systems? He's in a secured cell under constant surveillance. He has no tools, no access, and no knowledge of our technology. The officer looked down. No, sir. I'm not suggesting that. I just thought it was worth considering. Consider it dismissed, Ornax said firmly. Now get back to your stations and find the real cause. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Among the lower-ranking crew, whispers spread. Some started to believe the human might be more dangerous than they'd thought. Others began questioning Ornax's judgment. If their captain couldn't control one lone prisoner, how could he be trusted to maintain control over the entire ship? In the days that followed, the human escalated his efforts. He began leaving small, deliberate clues in places he knew the crew would find them. A loosened panel here, a strange set of markings there. These weren't acts of random vandalism, they were calculated signals meant to unsettle the crew further. The more they believed he was active, the more their confidence would erode. And it worked. Guards started reporting phantom noises near the human cell. Maintenance crews claimed they saw brief flickers of movement on security monitors that were supposed to be focused on empty corridors. Ornax dismissed these reports as paranoia, but he couldn't ignore the growing unease among his officers. One night, the human made his first direct move. He freed himself from his restraints and slipped out of his cell. He didn't go far, just down the corridor to a storage room. There, he carefully gathered a few items. A length of thin cable, a small maintenance tool left behind by a careless engineer, and a tiny energy cell from a discarded device. He returned to his cell, resecuring the restraints so that no one would suspect he'd left. Over the next several days, he used these items to construct a crude but effective device that could overload a nearby console. He waited for the perfect moment to deploy it, an instant when the crew was already on edge from another malfunction. When the device activated, it caused a cascading failure in the environmental controls on the deck above his cell. The sudden temperature drop forced several officers to abandon their stations temporarily, adding to the chaos. By now, even Ornax was feeling the pressure. His usually confident demeanor had begun to crack. He barked orders more frequently, his tone sharper and less controlled. He spent longer hours in the command room, poring over reports, searching for any explanation other than the one he refused to consider, that the human was behind it all. In the midst of this chaos, the human began to turn his attention to the crew itself. He started speaking to the guards, subtly at first. "Long shift?" he'd ask, his tone conversational. Most of them ignored him, but a few would grunt in reply or mutter a quick, "yeah." He wasn't trying to make friends. He was planting seeds. By acknowledging their frustration and fatigue, he was positioning himself as someone who understood their struggles, someone who wasn't the source of their problems, but another victim of the ship's increasingly oppressive atmosphere. One guard, a younger crew member named Mura, hesitated when the human asked, "Why does the captain make you do double shifts?" Mura looked down the corridor, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "It's not the captain," he said quietly. "It's the malfunctions. Someone has to keep an eye on everything." "Doesn't seem fair," the human said simply. Mura didn't reply, but his expression suggested he agreed. It was a small crack, but the human knew that cracks could be widened. As the weeks wore on, the ship's problems mounted. The once pristine corridors were now littered with signs of hurried repairs, exposed panels, tangled wiring, and discarded tools. The crew's polished uniforms were replaced by rumpled, sweat-stained attire. The calm efficiency that had once defined the illustrious beacon had given way to tense arguments and hurried whispers. And through it all, the human sat quietly in his cell, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. His restraints were still loose. His mind was still sharp. And his determination to turn the tables on his captors burned brighter than ever. Tension aboard the illustrious beacon had reached a breaking point. What had started as minor malfunctions had grown into an almost daily onslaught of technical problems and internal disputes. Captain Orcs tried to maintain an air of authority, but his once loyal crew now muttered behind his back. No one said it outright, but the question hung in the air: was he losing control? In the confines of his cell, the human could feel the shift. He saw it in the way guards fidgeted at the door, in the frantic footsteps of maintenance crews running down the corridors, and in the hushed voices that drifted through the vents. The cracks in the crew's unity were widening, and the human knew it was time to press his advantage. His first step was subtle. One evening, during the quiet hours when most of the crew were off shift, he used the length of cable he'd pilfered to short out a panel in the adjacent corridor. The resulting power fluctuation triggered a cascading failure in the environmental controls, causing the temperature to drop rapidly. The crew scrambled to restore normal conditions, leaving several key stations temporarily unattended. With the corridor outside his cell in disarray, the human made his move. He slipped out of his restraints, which he'd left just loose enough to remove easily, and stepped into the hall. The emergency lighting bathed everything in a dim red glow. He moved quickly but quietly, staying low to avoid detection. He knew where he was going: the maintenance bay 2 decks down, where the ship's diagnostic equipment was stored. The maintenance bay was chaotic, with tools and panels scattered across the floor. The human didn't have much time. He found a console connected to the ship's diagnostics and began searching for the ship's main communication logs. His captors didn't realize that, over weeks of listening to their conversations, he'd learned enough of their language to understand basic commands. He worked quickly, bypassing security protocols and accessing logs that revealed the crew's growing frustrations. He downloaded these logs onto a portable data module he'd scavenged earlier and returned to his cell before anyone noticed his absence. When the ship's system stabilized, Captain Orcs called an emergency meeting. His officers filed into the command room, their faces grim. Ornax's usual confidence was gone, replaced by a sharp, "Enough!" Ornax's voice cut through the room. "That primitive creature is locked in his cell. He has no access, no means of interference. Focus on finding the real cause." The room fell silent. Ornax's words carried authority, but they no longer inspired confidence. His officers exchanged uneasy glances. The human, though, wasn't done yet. He'd sown doubt, but now he needed to push harder. Over the next few days, the human released the communication logs into the ship's internal network. Crew members began receiving fragments of their own recorded conversations, private complaints about Ornax, whispered doubts about his leadership, and angry mutterings about the increasing workload. The effect was immediate. Resentments that had simmered quietly now boiled over. Arguments erupted in the corridors. Senior officers struggled to maintain discipline as more and more crew members openly questioned their orders. Ornax, for his part, was furious. He ordered a full lockdown of the network, but by then the damage was done. His crew no longer trusted him, and worse, they no longer feared him. In his cell, the human watched and waited. The guards who brought him food avoided meeting his gaze. They were too preoccupied with the turmoil spreading through the ship. The human, meanwhile, prepared for the next phase of his plan. He had learned the ship's power distribution patterns, knew which systems were critical, and understood how to trigger more widespread disruptions. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A minor skirmish with a rival faction forced the illustrious beacon to divert power to its weapons systems. The human used this moment of distraction to sabotage a secondary power relay. The resulting failure caused a critical navigation system to go offline, throwing the ship off course. While the crew scrambled to fix the problem, the human made another excursion from his cell, this time accessing the mainframe directly. He didn't need long, just enough time to plant a simple code that would trigger a more severe systems failure when the ship reached its next destination. When Ornax learned of the latest malfunction, he erupted in anger. "This is deliberate," he bellowed. "Someone on this ship is trying to undermine us. I want every deck searched, every system combed for evidence." But as the crew turned inward, searching for a saboteur, they only grew more divided. Some whispered that the human might be responsible after all, while others suspected each other. Trust dissolved, and with it, the crew's cohesion. The turning point came when a junior officer openly defied Ornax during a command meeting. "Captain," the officer said, her voice trembling but firm, "with all due respect, you've led us into a crisis. We're not functioning as a crew anymore. The ship is falling apart." Ornax stared her down, his face taut with barely controlled rage. "You dare to challenge me?" "Yes," she said. "Because if someone doesn't, we're all going to be dead before we reach port." The room went silent. Ornax's authority, once unquestioned, now hung by a thread. In the shadows, the human smiled. He knew what came next. The crew would fracture further, and when the time was right, he would step forward, not as a captive, but as a leader. Chaos engulfed the illustrious beacon. The once pristine corridors were littered with hastily abandoned tools, open access panels, and exposed wiring. Officers shouted over one another as alarms blared in the background. Ornax paced the command deck, his pale face tight with frustration, his voice hoarse from hours of barking orders. His crew had always followed his commands without question. Now, they moved sluggishly, casting uncertain glances at one another, their loyalty frayed by weeks of confusion and fear. "Get those stabilizers online," Ornax roared. "We're sitting ducks without them." "Yes, Captain," an officer replied, his tone weary. He turned back to his console, muttering under his breath. At the heart of the ship's unraveling stood the human. He hadn't been seen outside his cell in weeks, not by those who reported directly to Ornax, anyway. Yet his presence loomed over every decision. Every officer had heard rumors of his cunning, his resilience. The term Deathworlder was now whispered with a mix of awe and trepidation. In truth, the human had been watching. Listening. Waiting. He had taken note of the crew's faltering morale, the cracks in their chain of command. He knew when they held meetings, which officers grumbled the loudest, and who avoided Ornax's gaze entirely. While the crew struggled with failing systems and each other, he prepared for the moment he would step out of the shadows. It came when the illustrious beacon stumbled into a new crisis. A rival ship appeared on long-range sensors, an enemy vessel notorious for taking no prisoners. The crew, already battered by internal strife, scrambled to respond. But the ship's weapon systems were still partially offline, the stabilizers refused to engage, and the navigational computer kept cycling through error codes. "They're closing in," an officer reported, panic clear in his voice. "Launch the interceptors," Ornax ordered. "We can't, Captain. The hangar doors are jammed." Ornax slammed his fist on the console. "Then bring main weapons online. Do it manually if you have to. They'll be in range in 5 minutes, another officer said. Ornax turned to his crew, his eyes blazing. "This is it. You all want to question my leadership? Fine. Prove yourselves now, or die where you stand. Fix this ship. Arm the weapons. Do it now." But his outburst wasn't met with the same fervor as before. The officers exchanged glances, their movements hesitant. Some followed his commands, but others froze, overwhelmed by the prospect of a fight they were no longer certain they could win. Ornax could feel their doubt, and it burned. The human watched all of this unfold from the lower decks. He'd found a vantage point where he could observe the chaos above without being seen. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. The mighty illustrious beacon, its crew so proud and arrogant, was on the verge of collapse. And they hadn't even faced the enemy yet. With the rival ship closing in, the human moved swiftly. He left his hiding spot, his movements deliberate. The corridors were quieter than usual, most of the crew were stationed on the command deck or in engineering. He reached a small maintenance bay he'd identified days earlier and opened an access panel. Inside were the emergency power relays Ornax's engineers had failed to fully restore. The human knew these systems well enough by now to trigger a controlled surge. The ship shuddered as emergency power kicked in. For a moment, the lights stabilized, and some of the ship's systems came back online. On the command deck, the officers looked up in surprise. "Stabilizers are back," one shouted. "I don't know how, but they're back." "Main weapons are charging," another reported. "We'll have firing capability in 2 minutes." Ornax didn't question the sudden turn of fortune. He seized the opportunity. "You see," he said, his voice rising. "This is the result of proper leadership. Stay the course. We'll take that enemy vessel down." But the crew wasn't as easily convinced. They exchanged wary looks, still unsure if Ornax was the leader they needed. The human had planted enough seeds of doubt that even this moment of recovery couldn't fully restore their faith. Meanwhile, the human worked his way toward the command deck. He moved through maintenance tunnels and side passages, avoiding patrols. When he finally arrived at the upper levels, he waited just out of sight, listening. Ornax was rallying his officers, barking orders and declaring their superiority. The human listened to the captain's words, noting the strain in his voice. It was the tone of a man clinging to power. The rival ship drew closer. The illustrious beacon fired its first shots, scoring a few glancing blows. The enemy responded with a barrage of their own, rocking the ship violently. Consoles sparked, and officers scrambled to maintain control. Ornax shouted above the chaos, demanding faster repairs, sharper aim. In that moment of turmoil, the human stepped onto the command deck. The officers nearest the door saw him first, their eyes widening in shock. A ripple of gasps spread through the room as more and more crew members turned to see the man who had been the subject of so many rumors. His presence was like a cold wind sweeping through the room, silent but undeniable. Ornax turned slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to anger. "You," he snarled. "How did you get out of your cell?" The human didn't answer right away. He let the silence hang, let the crew take in the sight of him standing there, calm and unarmed, yet radiating an aura of control. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "You've already lost," the human said. Not to that ship out there, but to yourselves. Look around. Your crew is broken. They don't trust you. They don't believe in you. And they shouldn't. Ornax's hands balled into fists. You dare to? I'm not here to fight you, the human said, cutting him off. I'm here because your crew needs someone who can lead. Someone who can keep them alive. He turned his gaze to the officers, his eyes steady. You've seen what he's done. He's driven you to the brink. I'm offering you a choice. Stand with him and face destruction, or follow me and survive. The command deck fell silent. The officers looked at one another, their expressions conflicted. Ornax barked, he's manipulating you. He's a Deathworlder, a savage. No, one of the senior officers said quietly, stepping forward. He's right. Captain Ornax, you've led us into chaos. I don't trust you anymore. Another officer nodded. I don't either. This ship is falling apart under your command. One by one, the crew voiced their dissent. Ornax's face twisted in fury. You'll regret this, he hissed. You think he can save you? He's just a... The human stepped forward, cutting him off with a single, calm sentence. You've had your chance. The tension in the room snapped. Ornax lunged at the human, but two officers held him back. Captain, stand down, one said. You're done. With Ornax restrained, the human turned to the crew. We're not out of this yet. Get the stabilizers online. Power up the weapons. Let's show that ship out there that we're not finished. The crew snapped into action, this time working with a sense of purpose. Under the human's guidance, they stabilized the ship's systems, focused their firepower, and coordinated their defenses. The rival vessel, expecting an easy victory, was forced to retreat after a fierce exchange. When the battle was over, the crew let out a collective sigh of relief. The human stood at the center of the command deck, not as a captive, but as a leader. He turned to Ornax, who was being escorted to a holding cell. I told you, the human said quietly. You thought I was your pet. But it turns out, I'm the one you couldn't tame. As Ornax was led away, the human turned back to the crew. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust would take time to build, and the ship still needed extensive repairs. But for the first time since his capture, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had taken their arrogance, their belief in their own superiority, and turned it against them. Now, he was in control. And he wasn't about to let that go.